Mr Deputy President, I was proposing to speak on the second read because I
Please
haven't
go
had the
ahead.
opportunity to do that.
Yes.
And I don't intend to speak on the amendment in this contribution. And I acknowledge that there has been an extensive second read debate. I also acknowledge that it has taken me some time to get across the detail of this Act because hunting is not part of my my life experience. It's one of the unusual things of being in this place, that you find your knowledge extended in a range of areas, and you're encouraged to think about things that you may not otherwise have thought about. I'm not even really a fisher, and my only real experience of hunting is we lived in America for some time, Mr Deputy President, and as is the way, we're invited over by friends from the school, enjoyed a lovely dinner, and then the father of the family who'd been entertaining us explained that he'd killed everything that we'd eaten and proceeded to tell us how he'd butchered all the food and how he stocked the family pantry at regular intervals. And I must admit I was taken aback, again because it was completely outside my life experience. But then I realised that if somebody had called me and said, I caught a great barramundi today, come for a barbecue, I'd be delighted, and really that this was not functionally different. So, and I can see the way in which responsible hunting can be used to provide appropriately. I think really though that the best contribution I can make is within an area where I have some familiarity, and I admit that part of my contribution is really more in the realm of questions than of statements about the bill. On my reading of the bill, it makes several references to a designated minister. This is something with which I'm unfamiliar in other legislation. And I have concerns, and I would very much appreciate it if these concerns could be addressed before we are to vote on this bill, because as I read the bill, there seems to be a requirement for a person to be appointed as a Minister for Hunting. And that seems to be a legislative direction for this to happen. However, my understanding of the separation of powers and the way that responsible government works is that ministers are appointed by the governor, acting on the advice of the Premier of the day. And so I have concerns that this legislation and the way it is drafted actually steps outside our understanding of the doctrine of responsible government and the separation of powers, and is legislatively seeking in some way to bind an executive power which really rests with the governor, understood in the sense of responsible government, to be acting on the advice of the Premier of the day. I am just not familiar with any other legislation that creates a minister in perpetuity, as it were, who always has to be appointed. It's interesting to reflect on the New South Wales Constitution and indeed the Australian Constitution, which is entirely silent about the position even of Prime Minister, because these things are in the purview of executive government, not legislative government. And I am concerned that we treat these matters too lightly, and that we don't recognise the great strengths that we have in our system. I have been very concerned about some of the legislation that we have been encouraged to pass over the last 6 months, which treats retrospective legislation lightly, which seeks to change the goalposts after events have occurred. And I think it is really important that we actually stop and look at these things very carefully. And so I have deep concerns about this, and would appreciate it if somebody was in a position to, perhaps the government has received advice on this, perhaps there is legal advice in relation to this, and it would be very helpful, I think, for our deliberations. The second concern that I have is that the bill speaks of a right to hunt. We are, I believe, in a time where we are in danger of actually eroding what rights really mean by producing vast shopping lists of rights. And I don't mean this as a trivial example, but I happen to be talking to a teacher today whose students are apparently in the process of complaining, I believe, to the International Court of Human Rights, because they have been denied their human right for a class party. Now, obviously, that's a bit of nonsense, and I don't mean to trivialise this with that example, but it's a good example, I think, of the way that we often inflate rights talks, and I don't understand the jurisprudence of a right to hunt. I don't understand where that comes from. And it worries me that the more we sort of add rights and embroider rights and get away from the core of what rights are, that they actually come to mean less and less and less. And again, this is not so much a matter of this particular bill, but it is a way that we are approaching legislation and approaching talk about rights, which will, I think, actually lead to a diminution of our rights and will actually lead to us enjoying less rights. Rights, in my understanding, and again, this is a concern I have generally about any legislated rights. Rights in a free, open society do not come from Parliament. The government doesn't give us our rights. They are inalienable, they are part of who we are as human beings, and the government is required to respect those rights. And that really is what the focus should be. And so I suppose really what I'm saying is I do not understand the jurisprudential framework of a right of hunting. I don't know who that would be asserted against. And the other thing I think we miss a lot in the rights discourse is the importance of rights being balanced with responsibilities. I am not for one moment suggesting that those people seeking to exercise a right to hunt would not behave responsibly. But we need to have this, I think, knitted into the framework of any rights discussion. And again, I suppose I say that we live in a freer society, I believe, when rights are respected by government rather than seen as being created by government, when rights are perhaps better protected through the common law. And the very idea that something that is inalienable can be put in legislation which can then be changed by a subsequent parliament, as if somehow this body can tinker with and change what our rights would be, I find very disturbing. And I think it sets a really unfortunate precedent in relation to this. So I acknowledge that interjection, and in fact I have deep concerns about that approach for some of the reasons that I have advanced. And in fact, interestingly, in relation to that interjection, one of the difficulties that legislating rights creates is that there is a very strong argument that actually erodes rights because it undermines the principle of legality. Because if you're familiar with the work, for example, of Gleeson in Alcatab and Godwin or Spiegelman in the Macpherson lectures, you would understand that that the whole principle of legality rests on a lacuna, rests on the idea that Parliament has actually not addressed a particular issue, and when we do start addressing those issues, we actually run the risk of the courts not being able to exercise that principle of legality, which has been a protection of our rights for centuries. And so, look, I apologise that this really is a speech in relation to questions and concerns, but these are questions and concerns I have about the way that this legislation could move us, and I am uncomfortable moving forward with this legislation until I have some sense of the answers to this. I hope someone has done some thinking about these issues, and I look forward to hearing these matters addressed.
Ms Scarlett, just before you finish your contribution.
Sorry.
As a position of fairness that I would extend to all members, I asked, was this your second read or to the amendment?
Yes.
As I don't have a speaking list in front of me. Members would be aware that you can speak to the second read. However, the amendment has been moved before your second read. You can't come back now and have a second bite at the amendment later on. If you need to speak to the amendment, you can do it now.
Okay.
So I'm extending that courtesy as I would to any member so that they know their position.
Look, I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr Deputy President. If I may speak very briefly to the amendment, and as I understand it, and thank you for the clarification earlier, the effect of the amendment of the Honourable Damien Tudhope is to ensure that the bill be put in 6 months. Am I correct in, was that my understanding? Okay, so the two. Okay, so with respect to Ms Abigail Boyd's amendment, assuming that the committee is able to get advice about the issues that I have raised, I see a very good purpose behind that amendment, and I apologise, I'm not aware of the exact terms of reference that any committee would be investigating, but if that committee was a suitable place to investigate those issues, then I think, yes, I would absolutely support that amendment. With respect to the 6 months amendment, well, I'm always happy to support anything done by the Honourable Damien Tudhope. But I also recognise that the wisdom. Look, there are big issues about this bill. I mean, I have flagged some, others have flagged different issues. And this is an important bill, and I think it's an important bill for all those people in New South Wales who enjoy hunting as a sport. I think it's for all those people in New South Wales who want to see a way in which hunting can be used to control invasive species, and how we... Anything in the environmental space is always a question of balance. It's never a question of we just want this species or we just want that species. We have to balance. And there are difficult questions of balance in this legislation. So to the extent that this would help us address these questions, I would support the amendment of the Honourable Damien Tudhope, because we want to get this right. And certainly from the correspondence that I have received on this, there are a number of interested people in New South Wales, and they want to make sure that we get this right. And so I think that would be very helpful. So thank you for the opportunity to contribute, Mr Deputy President.
Thank you.